Hey everybody, it's CVH here, and today we'll be talking about the monthly reward card for March 2017 in the Elder Scrolls Legends. Just talking about its competitive viability, just giving my first impressions about the card and where it might fit in. I've done this for the past few monthly reward cards actually, but I don't think ever before I've been so excited to talk about the card revealed on a video. Just due to the competitive nature of this card, I really think it could see a lot of play. So without further ado, if you haven't seen the card already, just recently announced, we have it here, Sower of Revenge. So first and foremost, this card is the first monthly reward card that is a class-specific card. You can only play this in Warrior, obviously. It's Strength and Endurance, red and purple, so Warrior decks are the only ones that can make use out of it. And that's important to talk about, I think, at the beginning, because Warrior is sort of a class that's been a little bit less loved than the other classes throughout the brief history of the game so far. Many people just simply don't respect it, even though mid-range Warrior has been seeing a slight rise in popularity recently. We recently rated it fairly high on the Between the Lanes meta snapshot, for example, with a few players like myself playing it to high legend ranks. But on the whole, the class just sort of doesn't get the respect it deserves, and maybe for some it's sort of a well-earned disrespect because it hasn't performed super highly until very recently, at the very least. Typically delegated to orcs. Orcs are like what the class is mainly known for, but like I said, decks like midrange Warrior and even sort of control decks, but mostly midrange in the context of this card, are looking for new tools, and I think this card really does deliver. So let's talk about the basics first and foremost. We're really looking for something playable here to give Warrior that competitive edge. We have a 5-drop 5/5, so it's already pretty reasonably statted, not too expensive, and the 5/5 makes sense. It's a Tusked Bristleback already, so I'm already looking like I'm going to pick this in Arena at least a bit, with Guard, so, definitely pretty reasonable there, just a strict benefit, I would say. And Last Gasp deals 5 damage to the enemy player. Now, we're looking for an effect that really puts this card over the top, and I think we found it. 5 damage is a hell of a lot of damage, and as Last Gasp, it's basically unavoidable as long as the card presents a reasonable enough threat to where your opponent's going to be wanting to kill it, and as a 5-attack creature with the cost of 5, I think that does put enough pressure on the board at the time it's played to make your opponent really feel like killing it. So obviously the Last Gasp is a pretty aggressive effect, we'll be getting to more of that in a minute, but the fact that it has Guard as well, without a Silence, that means no matter what, your opponent is going to be forced to deal with this and proc the Last Gasp effect. So if you're up against a more aggressive deck, they're going to be having to get through this before they go face and hit you for more damage, and if you're up against a more defensive deck, they're going to be having to attack this before they trade with any of your other creatures, which might be higher priority to kill for them. Maybe you have something else with more attack like a Lumbering Ogrim you can protect, and of course when this card dies, the Last Gasp is going to trigger and deal 5 damage to your opponent. So that is huge, right? So we already have a 5-attack creature with the Last Gasp dealing 5, which is way more than like a House Kinsman. It deals more damage than a Face Lightning Bolt. If this card is able to live for 1 turn and get an attack for 5 in, and then eventually be killed, that's a third of your opponent's life total dealt with by 1 card, despite, not even to say anything about whatever the other creatures in your deck have been doing up to that point. So this card, it seems like it's going to be putting the end to a lot of games very quickly. If you've been mounting somewhat of an assault from turns 1 through 4, you drop this on turn 5, and I feel like a lot of concede buttons are going to be pressed. If the life total has already been threatened substantially, they're going to realize, well, I can't answer the Sower of Revenge, I don't have a Silence available to me right now, I guess it's just going to kill me. In much the same ways as House Kinsman does, except House Kinsman is much less high statted. But yeah, 5-drop 5/5 with Guard even. So where does this card fit in? I think the obvious inclusion would be many mid-range Warrior decks, and a lot of people are even considering whether or not that'll make this deck way too powerful if this card is even OP. I wouldn't say this card is OP. I would say one thing that tends to happen is a lot of cards that I don't think wind up seeing much competitive play are rated as good by the community at large. A lot of people do want to find the possibilities of the card being playable as opposed to a card being unplayable. A lot of people try to look for the optimistic glass is half full instead of the pessimistic glass is half empty when they're rating cards for the first time. And when a card that does look like it's going to see a good amount of play like this is released, immediately due to that other overestimation of the other cards, a card can, like this, Sower of Revenge, can seem kind of OP contextually. I don't think that's really the case. I think this card is probably going to wind up being a little bit pretty balanced, but especially when you're rating it against other single attribute cards. This is a class-specific card, so we do expect more, and the class-specific cards for Warrior are kind of lackluster at the moment. Gortwog fits into some mid-range Warrior decks, some slower Warrior decks, but besides that, it's really known for being a powerful Orc, and Militant Chieftain, obviously, is basically only played in Orcs, and, that's sort of a setback for the class because all the other classes have pretty useful for the most part. Epics and legendaries that are class specific, but Sower of Revenge is really going to push the aggressive warrior archetype, not necessarily in orcs. And it does compete for a turn 5 slot, which is one reason some people have even said it might not be good, is because it is competing with the chieftain and orcs, and it is competing with Shadowfen priests and other decks. However, I do think the effect is really making this see play, and I think what that's trying to do is make people want to play warrior specifically for their aggressive or mid-range decks. And I think it does a really good job of that. Like I said, 5 damage from the effect, 5 damage from the attack if it is able to get through. This card is a huge threat on the board, bigger than something a lightning bolt can deal with. Your control opponent having to waste a piercing javelin just to take 5 damage immediately is not something they're going to want to do. One of the things that is worth mentioning is that 5 damage is sort of the magic number for runes. So chances are if you're attacking with this card, you're going to be breaking a rune. Chances are if you're if this card is dying, the effect is going to be proccing a rune break, so your opponent could potentially get an out or another card. If they're javelining this, they might, break the rune and get a lightning bolt to deal with something else, but still, you're an aggressive deck, and you want to be dealing damage if you're playing this card. This card, although it has guard, it does not look like it will be fitting into many control decks, simply because the life that you're dealing to your opponent is probably going to be more of a hindrance than a help to you at that point. If you're trying to go long, you don't really need the 5 damage immediately. Unlike a card like House Kinsman, it doesn't actually heal you for anything, so pretty much a one-trick pony in that aspect, although I think the guard has really neat implications in mid-range versus mid-range situations. Very few creatures are able to attack over this efficiently. High King Emmerich comes to mind as one of the ones that is good at it, but it is slower than the Sower of Revenge in the first place. Many things that you'll be playing up until turn 5 can't deal with this card efficiently, and of course when you're in a sort of a race situation, being able to guard against your opponent's Shadow Lane, for example, and if they kill it, that's still 5 damage getting through. That is a big swing, and I think that's going to put Midrange Warrior on the map as one of the very competitive midrange decks of the new metagame, hopefully past Fall of the Dark Brotherhood. Of course, we're going to have this card for a few days before Fall of the Dark Brotherhood releases, but yeah, those are pretty much my thoughts. I think it's very, very powerful. As far as the competition with other 5-drops, it does compete notably with Shadowfen Priest. That's really one of the main ones. It also competes with Markarth Bannerman and Blood Dragon. I could definitely see running this card alongside Blood Dragon if you're just trying to push a lot of damage. Markarth could be kept to more token-based strategies. This card is probably doing the whole pushing damage thing a lot better, with less of the gimmicks and more of just the raw stats and the raw, crazy direct damage dealing effect. As far as Shadowfen Priest goes, some midrange warrior decks such as my own have already taken it out in favor of Earthbone Spinner just for the more reasonably costed silence effect. However, if you do play Shadowfen Priest, I do think if you're running more of an aggressive deck, Sower of Revenge might make even more sense. If your main concern is the damage you're pushing Earthbone into Sower of Revenge, that sort of makes a lot of sense, and that might be one of the goals of this card being released. Shadowfen Priest is very ubiquitous, as I talked about in my card analysis on the card, and maybe they're trying to release more 5-drops that can truly compete with it in decks that do run Shadowfen Priest. This card does a really good job of that, just because, it's super huge value for a 5-drop, really, really powerful card, and while it doesn't really have the utility of a Shadowfen Priest, the raw power of this card doing what it does best, which is pushing damage and winning races, I think would make it an inclusion even over the Shadowfen Priest in many of these types of decks. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, the card is somewhat weak to silence, but you're still getting a Tusked Bristleback worth of value as a 5-drop 5/5. Overall, I think this card is incredibly playable. I'm super excited to see it on the ladder. I'm super excited to see it making some warrior decks even more competitive, really diversifying the scope of mid-range decks, which is where I really see this card, or maybe topping out an aggro curve as a potentially defensive option. But yeah, I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment. Join the discussion. Let me know what you think of Sower of Revenge, if you think it's overpowered, if you think it's somehow underpowered, what decks you would like to see this card be used in the upcoming meta. Anything from Fall of the Dark Brotherhood you think could work well with this and sort of maybe create meta decks where before there were only memes. So yeah, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Feel free to leave a like if you've enjoyed the video. Leave a subscription to the channel for more analysis, first impressions videos, strategy content, deck techs. Follow the stream at the link below for daily Legends streams, and I will see you guys next time.